Hello and welcome back to the Richard Hunter interview, where I sit down with guests who know the city best to talk about the trends, triumphs and turmoil that affect your investments. I'm delighted to be joined today by Richard Wilson, Chief Executive Officer of both Aberdeen Personal Wealth and Interactive Investor. Richard joined Aberdeen in May 2022 following the acquisition of Interactive Investor and was appointed CEO of its personal vector in August 2022. He leads the Aberdeen Director of Consumer Businesses, including II. In this episode, we will be discussing Richard's views on investing and which areas of particular interest to him there are as an investor. So Richard, a very warm welcome to you and thank you for spending some of your time with us today. Before we get into your particular areas of interest, why do you think now more than ever it's important to be investing?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much for having me. Well, if you look at what's happened in the UK over the last decade or so, the responsibility for your long-term financial future has increasingly fallen into your own hands. The days of the defined benefit pension have largely gone. So now your long-term financial health is down to you. And that really then is a question of how you invest. And the eighth wonder of the world, as they say, is compounding. So you really want to start investing as early as possible to be in the best place that you can in the longer run to have the life that you want to lead.
That's right. And of course, it's not the rich man's game it once was, either in terms of the minimum amount you need to invest or the extraordinary amount that you need to pay.
Well, what's happened in the last 10 years, and I'm very proud that we've been part of that process, is both to reduce the cost of access to investing from what might have been £100 a trade back in the noughties to now either free investing or, in our case, you get free trades, but a standard price being £3.99, which makes investing available to all. In fact, we've just introduced a pensions product called Pensions Essential, which provides all the services you need from starting to drawdown for as little as £5.99 a month. So access has changed dramatically. So has the experience available. Part of the problem or challenge for all of us is that we struggle with confidence to invest, and it can be very confusing. What technology has allowed us to do is increasingly make that experience easier so that it's more straightforward to make those choices that are best for you. And progressively, the regulator and the FCA has also been supporting and making some of those choices more straightforward, whether it be clarifying the guidance and advice so that more people can take advantage. The last thing, of course, is that the choice of investments have expanded dramatically in the last 20 years, where any adult in the UK can choose between 50,000 different instruments around the world, which is, of course, a mixed blessing because that can be also like entering into a supermarket with no labels. But that choice has got greater. So for the UK retail investor and for UK PLC, many of the ingredients are there to help people along that journey.
Which segues perfectly into my next question. You've highlighted China and India as regions of interest, and perhaps before we get to that, we can just remind ourselves just how populous these countries are. According to the latest figures we have, there's a global population of 8.1 billion. India is number one with 1.43 billion people, and China just behind in second at 1.42 billion. And just by way of comparison, the number for the US is 340 million and the UK 68 million. So perhaps we could start with your thoughts on and opportunities arising from India, Richard.
Thank you. Because you've spelled out why, by definition, those markets are interesting. They're just enormous, and they've been growing, although their experience and situation is quite different. If you look at India first, on the one hand, you've got an economy there which has been growing at around 6.5% GDP and is expected to sustain that for in the medium term, and it's inflation and interest rates have been moderating now. I think this year it's this year 2023 is looking like sort of 5% print on inflation and interest rates moderating down to that level as we look further into 2024. So that gives you a headline growth number, which for a large economy is substantially ahead of most of the other leading economies of the world. India's already overtaken the UK in terms of GDP, and it's expected to overtake both Germany and Japan in terms of GDP in the next 2 or 3 years. So you've got a country that is clearly of interest. At the same time, what you see there is an economy that has a functioning democracy. Those two different words, and a stable government. Modi, I think, has been in for nearly 10 years now, and based upon the state elections that took place in December, you'd expect in the autumn elections that you'd have to be a brave man to bet against him continuing in power, which provides a lot of consistency. As well as that, you have the legal structure in India is something which is largely inherited from the English law, which provides a level of kind of legal certainty. And digitization-wise, it has, according to most opinion, the most digitized economy in the world. And of the 1.4x billion people, I think now over 1 billion people have the digital ID cards, which is quite extraordinary. So relative to the rest of the world, you have to look at India as being somewhere which has a material opportunity. And you look at individual sectors, whichever they may be, and of course there's been all sorts of complications through COVID to get real transparency what's going on. But you look at the property market in India, and you look at the fact there's roughly an 80 million deficit in housing units with a growing economy, where the middle class is expected to grow by around 20 million a year over the next 20 years. You have clearly areas of substantial opportunity as the economy and the population becomes wealthier. That's a similar story historically if you look at China coming back, but clearly China's context is both compelling on the one hand, because you look at whilst the growth rates have come off materially, and now I think they're sitting at GDP growth is about 4.5%, and interest rates and inflation expected to drop down to something around 2 or 1.75. It has 450 million in its middle class. It is, by any stretch of the imagination, the economy which will compete with the US as the largest economy. There's obviously different views about whether and when that will take place, but it is clearly an extraordinarily influential economy. At the same time, you have more recent concerns which introduce on some question marks, the most important of which is the US-Chinese tensions around Taiwan, and in fact in the other conflicts of the world, which creates some concern. You've got the post-COVID recovery and what's happened to the Chinese economy in the short run, which again it now appears to be dipping into deflation. And you have state intervention in the large consumer tech businesses, which obviously raises concern in terms of competition. So they're very different stories. Both economies, as you say, in terms of population, are somewhere around 3 billion of the world's 8 billion population, which is clearly a significant chunk. Between those two, given the different contexts, I mean, my vote goes for India today, and hopefully in the near term, the US and Chinese economic vital interests will encourage those governments to find some accommodation on the other issues that they've been struggling with.
Certainly in terms of the nuances between these two massive countries, both were driven some years ago by, as you mentioned, the emergence of the middle class, as well as urbanisation. Certainly in terms of China, there was additional propulsion as the Chinese began to adopt Western medicine, which obviously put the cat amongst the pigeons in the pharmaceutical sector, because again, you're opening up a potentially massive market. Are those themes still in place for either or both?
Well, you've got, on the one hand, those themes are still what drives those conversations. You have a transparency issue in one of those markets, China. It's actually quite hard to be clear what's actually going on and what the actual facts are, which is unhelpful. And India, by contrast, has struggled to find its feet in the manufacturing sector compared to the powerhouse that China has been. But between those two, I mean, the one thing that would tend to increase confidence in one versus the other is India being a democracy versus China being a command economy, and your ability to flex and adapt and compete your way in different sectors, whether it be pharmaceuticals or technology or manufacturing, you have to believe that that whilst a command economy can get things done quickly, it's not as adaptive as a market economy, which can flex to new targets as your assumptions are affected by reality, because as technology changes your view of what the future looks like.
So for those, and there will be many of our viewers whose interest has been piqued in India in particular, the next question is how to gain exposure to India, for example. Clearly, as you mentioned at the very start, it's rather more straightforward to get exposure these days than it was 20 years ago. So what sort of things could investors be looking for a nice exposure to India?
Well, there are a number of diversified funds and ETFs that have both specific focus on India and China, and within their different segments of those markets. As a non-resident, it's possible but very hard to invest directly in the Indian stock market, and impossible or improbable to invest in the Chinese market today directly. So you really do need to invest via some diversified product, of which there are most of the providers, most of the asset managers have a range of products which do that, and they're reasonably cost effective and provide you with some balanced exposure either to the economy or to particular sectors inside that economy.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because it also depends on what level of exposure you want. For example, even within our own FTSE 100, you've got mining stocks which are in and out of favour depending on the perceived demand situation moment from China in particular. You've got the likes of Prudential, who are now battling down in Asia and Africa, so that's effectively a China play. Not to mention the likes of Burberry, of course, where the power of the tourist and the health of the China economy is something that's very important. So there are also other ways to put your foot in the door as well.
There are, and of course you also have some areas like consumer tech, which from being the darling, all of a sudden you see some state intervention and confidence in that sector gets disrupted. So you've also got the question of trust in the environment is what you see, what you get. And for as long as China is perceived to be intervening, that obviously will take it will create a bit of a discount, frankly, on some investments, as a large part of their value is about confidence in a stable environment, which in the last year or so, China's clearly exhibited the will to materially intervene in some sectors.
Well, I know we could go on for hours, but we are unfortunately out of time. So thank you very much indeed, Richard, once again for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for watching. I'll be back soon with another Richard Hunter interview. But in the meantime, you can find more expert investing insight on the Interactive Investor website at ii.co.uk. And you can, of course, find more interviews on the II YouTube channel. Bye for now.